Mark was the first canonical gospel written. Full stop. This particular question is considered settled for nearly all biblical scholars who study this issue. Here's what renowned religious studies professor Dr. Mark Goodacre says on the issue. Quote, "In spite of some strong critiques of some poor arguments in favor of the priority of Mark, this theory remains one of the surest building blocks in New Testament scholarship." But what if this assertion and the premises that underlie it are totally wrong? Or more accurately, fatally logically flawed? Not only would that be a bold proposition, after all, this is one of the few matters considered settled in biblical studies, but it would necessarily upend 200 years of New Testament scholarship. If you stick around, you'll find that the assertion that Markan priority is logically flawed is unassailable. It may hold up on other grounds that are agenda-driven or idiosyncratic, but logic cannot be one of them. When we conclude our examination, you'll be left with the inescapable truth that, at least with the evidence we currently have, Markan priority does no better to explain the findings than does the priority of any other gospel. But we'll go one step further and show why, logically, we're not even permitted to entertain Markan priority on the current data set. So at this point, you're probably asking something like, if you're so certain, how could so many scholars be wrong? Or, who are you to claim to have more knowledge than the academics? Or even, what's your agenda? No, it's not that modern scholars are clueless or illogical, or that I know more than they do. In fact, many, including Professor Goodacre quoted earlier, are amongst the most brilliant and sincere minds in all of academia. The reason we're here is mostly historical, and it starts with the logical error made early in the 20th century, an error that is at once elementary but at the same time has had lasting ramifications. Most modern scholars were taught Markan priority at a time when this error had not been fully fleshed out, and they've since moved on from the issue studying other topics. So even when we acknowledge a consensus, it's worth noting that the vast majority of scholars today haven't even had the occasion to reconsider the positions they were taught. So let's jump into that history, but to set the table, let's briefly discuss what the synoptic problem is. For our purposes here, the synoptic problem can be summarized as the observation that the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke share so much textual similarity that the dependence of one or more of these quote-unquote synoptic, which means seeing all together, Gospels on one another or on a shared third-party source can be presumed. For centuries, scholars have noted at least 4 types of commonalities between the synoptic Gospels. First is the amount of shared material. Second is the wording in that shared material. Third is a shared order. And fourth are shared editorial or parenthetical comments. Let's start with shared material and wording. The amount of shared material includes stories, sayings, and accounts of Jesus, such that over 90% of Mark's gospel is shared with either Matthew or Luke or both. Much of this shared material has identical or nearly identical wording, as you can see in the corresponding table. Here, Jesus is questioned about his authority, and he's asked, "By what authority are you doing these things?" with the exact same wording in each of the 3 Gospels. And there are numerous additional examples which are similar. Further, many of these stories and the words within those stories appear in the same order in the 3 Gospels, including arranging non-narrative material in ways that wouldn't be intuitive or obvious. For example, the stories are not in chronological order, and the texts are written in ancient Greek, which does not mandate word order. Finally, there are editorial or parenthetical comments which are found in multiple Gospels in the same place. In this example, we have the parenthetical, "Let the reader understand," appearing in the exact same place in 2 different Gospels, a coincidence that's unlikely to occur naturally. But unlikely doesn't mean impossible. Also, when I refer to copying here, I'm referring to the texts themselves and not, per se, any personal exchanges between the authors. And critically, I'm intentionally excluding non-testable or multi-assumption-laden hypotheses such as divine inspiration or independent perfect transcription of oral tradition and the like. It's not that these are impossible or even not present. Nothing here should be taken to presume that. Rather, it's that the modality chosen here is logic, and we don't multiply assumptions beyond the minimum necessary to give us a solution. We'll touch on this again and again over the course of the series. So we've arrived abductively at the presumption that there was copying, and thus the synoptic problem is who copied whom and who was first. Abduction is when we find the simplest and most probable explanation for a set of findings. It's commonly used in forensics to solve crimes and in historical analyses where the parties and sometimes the evidence itself are no longer available. For example, if a detective arrives at a burglary scene with all the entry points triply locked and deadbolted, but sees a broken first floor window with a shoe print on it, they would argue that the entry and exit through that window was the best theory given the evidence. Even though that would not be a certain conclusion, it would be preferred to arguing that the perpetrator entered through a heavily locked door and then somehow triply bolted it before leaving, with the broken window being somehow attributed to coincidence. Again, even though that improbable conclusion remains possible, it's not the simplest, consistent explanation of the evidence. As such, abductive reasoning is the only logical modality that is usable to solve the synoptic problem. This is critical to understand. Fantastic, wild speculation, while interesting, has no scientific value and for us will be avoided. This isn't to say we won't be using induction and deduction and other modalities as well for various proofs. We will. But when it comes to providing our conclusion, we will be drawing inferences to the best possible explanation. That is abduction. Let's get back to the data. 94% of Mark is shared with Matthew. 76% of Mark is shared with Matthew and Luke. In fact, only 3% of Mark is unique to Mark alone. So the question is, does this tell us anything whatsoever about who was first? If you recall from the intro video linked above, this is analogous to the situation of the man who found the 3 jars, where each of the jars had similar stories labeled 1 and 2, and the blue and the green jar had a similar story labeled number 3, and the blue jar alone had a story labeled number 4. We observed that this meant that 100% of the text in the red jar was found in the green jar, and only 66% of the text in the green jar was found in the red jar. We asked, since 100% of the red jar text is found in the green jar, does this mean that the red jar text came first? Applied to the synoptic problem, does the fact that 94% of Mark is found in Matthew, but Mark's content is only accounting for 46% of Matthew, mean that Mark came first? We know that this tells us absolutely nothing whatsoever about the order in which these Gospels were written. We know that to argue otherwise would be fallacious. Well, that's exactly what Oxford scholar B.H. Streeter argued in his landmark work on Markan priority in the early 20th century. There were 4 central pillars to his proof, with the first 2 being considered decisive. First was the argument from content, which referred to the fact that so much of Mark was in Luke and Matthew. As we've shown, that argument is logically silly and fallacious. The second argument, the argument from order, bears a little more discussion. Although it's no less fallacious, it's the single most important argument in the history of Markan priority. Without this argument, it's highly unlikely that the nearly 2,000-year consensus that Matthew was first would have ever been undone. At the very least, the unanimous position that Mark was the first gospel written would most certainly have never happened. But before we return to the argument from order, let's wrap up the last 2 of Streeter's arguments. The argument from wording refers to the fact that in the triple tradition, which is the content shared between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, most of the words in Mark are found in Matthew and Luke, either in one or the other or both. Additionally, Streeter observed that Matthew and Luke are more often in verbal agreement with Mark and almost never agreeing with each other against Mark. If it's not already clear, this is a variant of the fallacious argument from content, but it also bears aspects of the argument from order. Finally, the argument from modifications essentially argues that Matthew and Luke appear to be making modifications or improvements to a more quote-unquote primitive Mark. Today, this is the only argument from Streeter that scholars still draw upon. We touched on it briefly in the intro and we'll discuss its flaws throughout the series. If there's anything to be taken from Streeter's argument from order today, it's the finding that Mark is the quote-unquote middle term. Essentially, Mark is always either agreeing with Matthew and or Luke. While this might seem striking at first, we'll show that with respect to priority, this finding is meaningless and can be accounted for in multiple ways. For now, let's discuss Streeter's findings and conclusion. Streeter observed that in the triple tradition, where all 3 are not agreeing, one of 3 things is found. Mark and Luke agree in order and wording where Matthew does not agree. Mark and Matthew agree in order and wording where Luke does not agree. But Matthew and Luke never agree in order or wording against Mark. Streeter commented that this conjunction and alternation of Matthew and Luke in their agreement with Mark as regards A, content, B, wording, and C, order, is only explicable if they are incorporating a source identical or all but identical with Mark. As discussed earlier, it cannot be overstated how massive of an impact this had on the synoptic problem scholarship. For the next 80 or so years, nearly everyone who learned about the synoptic problem learned that Mark was first, and it was based on this argument. Let's look at an illustration. In these examples, Mark is first, followed by Matthew and Luke. When Matthew follows Mark and keeps Mark's order, and Luke follows Mark but changes Mark's order, Matthew and Luke will not agree in order. On the other hand, if Luke follows Mark but keeps Mark's order and Matthew changes the order, Luke and Matthew also won't agree in order. In both cases, either only Matthew or Luke is agreeing with Mark, and in both cases, Matthew and Luke are never agreeing with each other against Mark. But it wouldn't take long before scholars looking at the issue spotted the logical flaws. About 2 decades after Streeter, and with much less fanfare, B.C. Butler, a Roman Catholic bishop and Oxford graduate himself, would point out that the same observation could be found with Matthew being first. Again, an illustration. This time, Matthew is first, followed by Mark and then Luke. If Mark copies Matthew but changes the order, and Luke copies Mark instead of Matthew but keeps Mark's order, Luke and Matthew will not agree against Mark, and only Luke will be agreeing with Mark. Butler in fact showed that any possible arrangement of the Synoptic Gospels could yield similar findings. In short, the argument from order was circular and proved nothing about priority. Without naming Streeter by name, or Lachmann, who would later expand on Streeter's arguments, Butler would write that this was a schoolboyish error of elementary reasoning. This would come to be known as the Lachmann's fallacy. But the door had already been knocked off the hinge. Myriad papers and careers had already been built and will continue to be built on the foundation of Markan priority. As noted by Professor Goodacre earlier, scholars had moved on from the quote-unquote poor arguments, but newer, more innovative arguments would emerge. Unfortunately, these are no less problematic. Here's what Professor Goodacre says now. There are several good arguments in favor of Matthew's and Luke's dependence on Mark. The strongest are the arguments from omissions and additions, and from editorial fatigue. We discussed these in the intro, and we'll explore them in greater detail in the next videos. For now, if you're enjoying this content, please like and subscribe. Until next time.